So Charlie, I'm delighted to be here with you. I just wanted to also introduce myself here. So I'm Lyndon Rego. I'm the founder of CoMetta. And this is an effort really to build community in Greensboro. And what we're trying to do is a number of things, but including spotlighting people who've been working to make the community better. And as I heard about you and the work that you're doing from a number of different sources, I know you've had a very, very significant impact on Greensboro and a number of kinds of green spaces, the community gardens that we have. So I'm really delighted to be here with you today to be able to hear more about your story.
Great. Good to be here, Lyndon. Look forward to chatting with you.
Great. So, Charlie, maybe you could provide us with a little bit of a brief introduction. You've been doing a lot, but could you tell us about just a little bit about your story?
Well, I'm in my early 70s, so I have a long story. But I would say it's maybe, professionally two significant parts. One where I thought I was going to be a professor and I did the requisite certification for all that, and then discovered as soon as I got my PhD that I never wanted to write another critical paper or a book in my life. And but I fell in love with the classroom, and so I functioned as an adjunct faculty for a couple of decades and kind of loved the work, but it still committed me to a kind of life within the safety and behaviors of the academy, which were not outdoors. And I just found the constraints to be too many. And fortunately, with the kind of wholesale breakup of my life at middle age, a divorce, an end of being a full-time adjunct, I was very open to things and was surprised one day when I listened to a 15-minute presentation by a permaculture designer who talked about water and how important it is. And I mean, it sounds trivial, but I was so stung by it that I had lunch with him, and then I got training in permaculture, and I immediately started transforming my home into just a huge food forest. And then I was launched because people then asked me to get involved. And then the latter part of my life was my involvement with permaculture and gardens and so on, and eventually a concentration on urban permaculture. Yeah. Besides that, a family and 3 kids and all that brings, yes, in my life.
Can you say a little bit more about the permaculture idea? What's that about?
Well, what I was getting interested in gardening, and my gardening was raised beds, organic gardening, and it was all very efficient and well managed, and you kind of had total control over it all. And permaculture, though, is about entering into a partnership with nature where it knows more than I do, and therefore I must learn nature's way or ways and learn to imitate them in my work in my yard and other places, and also intensify them so that I learned, for instance, how to create soil and do the work of 500 years of soil building in 6 months. That's an example of an intensifying. I can work with a slope in such a way that it will store the water running down it and become a, kind of not waterlogged, but moist area receptive. And so I can speed up the work that nature might do over hundreds, even thousands of years on a given site, and activate the many things that then nature will just do on its own in terms of growing, maintaining itself, its own immunological system, and that kind of thing. And that just utterly fascinated me. It was like an endless intellectual puzzle I was putting together, but it all had to be done in a practical way on the ground. And somehow those two things working together just absolutely fascinated me. And I knew I just wanted to give the rest of my life, so far 3 decades of work, to bringing that about in whatever context was thrown at me.
So the way that you were talking about it, it felt really spiritual to me, like that you're working with nature rather than working sometimes against nature to fight nature. And I believe you're a professor of religious studies?
That was my field, religious studies.
And the way that you were talking about this, I mean, I could feel that ethos in there. Could you say something more about the connection between the two?
Well, it's interesting because eventually in religious studies, I took exams, my doctoral exams as a medievalist, because I was captured by let's say, the unified medieval worldview that people talk about. It's not as unified as people like to think, but nevertheless, that fascinated me. And then I eventually, though, did my dissertation on American wilderness as an other space. That is, that there was a kind of contested, unfinished relationship between humans and the natural world as we came and virtually conquered and took over this land mass, and wilderness always stood, in a sense, in opposition to it. And it was a very interesting study. And that's as far as I got, let's say, academically, but it meant as a teacher that I oriented all my courses in some way to include something about the natural world, until towards the end, half of the class was doing projects out in the community, coming down to my house, which was a walkable distance. And I was taking them through what I had done, and we would, our class, we'd gather vegetables together for a lunch and stuff like this. This was 30 students, and it's a very small lot that I have. It's less than 1/5 of an acre, but it's just so brimming with food and all that. I get students calling, and they remember me, and they said, that was the greatest class I've ever had, and stuff. Of course, we weren't doing the normal stuff. So I found that even something like religious studies, which typically is very high-minded, abstract, transcendental, can translate into a practice that is very real and concrete, and gets you deeply embedded in the natural world. And then it just really seems that it's so exciting, it just creates its own community, around that. And I was really pleased that students who had no idea what they were walking into, let's say with a religious studies class, discovered about the world, and we can just throw out the normal syllabus and do something more interesting. So,
great.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the word community. I want to come back to that in a moment, but I want to pick up on something that you said yesterday. So you spoke at an event we had yesterday called Pollinating Possibility, which was about green spaces in Greensboro. And you said something to the effect, if I remember you right, that every space is a green space.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we're seeing something that perhaps we don't think about so much in America, our front yard, which we normally have a lawn that is, in a way, trying to defeat nature and kind of create a certain kind of monoculture of grass. And you've thought about this in a very, very different way. Could you kind of unpack what you meant?
Well, it's interesting. It was with regards to listening to Nick's poem that I was suddenly.
Who's Nick, by the way? Could you say more?
Nick Graham is a young man who's a poet, and I'm just learning about him, but he is certainly a poet and typewriter poet. And I want him to meet Greensboro's other typewriter poet here, who's Graham Holt. And also, he just told me this morning about doing permaculture on a farm. So he's acquainted with that. And his the metaphors he was using and just the whole notion of pollinating gave me this image that, in fact, all these spaces are green spaces. Now, on one hand, that can mean all open spaces, front yards, parks, byways, the sides of railroad tracks and so on. That's kind of something that's literally true, and people are finding, yes, we can. But I also mean that the whole planet is green.
Yeah.
And it began green, and it will ultimately be green, because it's certainly, in a sense, the overpowering presence of it, that all spaces, and so these things of buildings and so on are simply conjuring acts by us to create something we think is solid. But if we've read the book that was written about when we leave, the world without us. The world without us is like in 10 years, all the roofs on houses cave in, and all our suburb homes are entangled in a green mass. And within 50 years or 100 years, even great cities just become green again.
Yeah.
And that said, we have to, if we can aim for that now while we still have a chance. Every space is a green space and ultimately follows nature's way.
Yeah.
So.
And so your work then over so many years here in Greensboro has been trying to find that intersection with maybe human beings and the way that we live and our needs, but also working in concert with nature and finding, I think, places that we can kind of coexist together. Could you say more about now the work that you've done over many, many decades to build this permaculture movement and community gardens and pollinator gardens and many, many things here in Greensboro? Tell us about that journey.
Well, it's so interesting that, I never began with, I'm not entrepreneurial at all. And I didn't really have anything in mind other than I had physical strength and I could gather around me younger people. Here I'm then going into my 40s and 50s, and I'm realizing that, I want these younger people, and together we can respond to anyone out there who wants something to happen at their home, their school, their church. And eventually it became like city government, businesses, and so on. So it really was just like responding. I think I got involved with schools because a fifth grade teacher had been to one of my workshops and said, will you come to us and give us a fifth grade garden and stuff like that? And that was Montessori school. And now the whole school, they advertise themselves as existing within a garden. They are a school within the garden, and it's probably the largest school garden on the East Coast. It's just phenomenal. Alice Waters was here from California, and she was the former Montessori teacher, and she was just bowled over, by like what's happening in Greensboro, North Carolina, that kind of thing. But it's just because we were invited there, and they said, "Oh, we want more." And we want the whole middle school. And then we said, we want the whole school. And then they said, now we want a special branch for middle school grades that Maria Montessori had set up for them to have these kind of live-in situations. And the same happened with churches, schools. I've done 5 or 6 public schools, couple of private schools like Montessori and the day school. And then the edible schoolyard with Alice Waters, IRC with the homeless, not a homeless daycare, but a homeless resource center. And that's interesting because that was a situation where we weren't necessarily invited in. And this is an interesting thing. Mm-hmm. We wanted to because, you know, we were mainly like white people wanting to help indigent people or people that needed help. And we thought they needed a garden.
Yeah.
And we did that. And it turned out they didn't want a garden. They wanted jobs. They wanted some clean clothes. They wanted a resume. They wanted a place they could get their mail, which is what, you know. And we worked so hard on that thing for 4 years and then didn't attract but 1 or 2 or 3 of the actual people using that center. And we just learned that, you know, if they don't ask for it, it's not right. It's not the right thing. So we learn from those mistakes. We make mistakes. And, you know, maybe someone else with a more, let's say, I would say, listening approach, but I'm not sure they'd even say, well, please do a garden again. But anyway, that's just an example. A lot of things have been torn down. The most beautiful project was at Elon Homes for Children. And we transformed that campus until all the homes of the kids were, that they ate there and lived in these and kind of went to school there on the grounds. And they were eating from the garden. And it was beautiful. And we had made these carpet ponds around. And therapists saw this place and they started holding group sessions in these spaces. And it was like just beyond imagination what was taking place there. And then the Methodist Church just said, well, we need the money. And they sold it all. And it's all houses now. And that was a very sad day. You know, I just walked off of that campus, well, crying, and because, you know, they couldn't see it, and they had 100 acres, and they could have kept 8, and of the campus itself. But I guess it's an expensive venture for them too. Yeah. So all kinds of things
happened. Something that, you know, I think is reflective of your work. You're an N of 1, you're one person, right? And you could certainly do things as you did at your home. However, I think what's been pretty remarkable about your efforts is that, you know, your fingerprints are all over the city in gardens everywhere. And you've really built a movement, if you will, of people who've kind of embraced, been inspired by this work, have stepped in and started to work alongside you and perhaps independently in kind of advancing this. So I wanted to kind of come back to that idea of community. And sometimes with what I'm trying to do is really think about, you know, how we can all be change makers, how we can take responsibility for our communities and step in and do the things that we can. And it could be about any number of things, whether it's working around housing issues or hunger issues, around the arts or green spaces. We all care about different things, but I think this notion of actually getting involved is another matter that today many of us, you know, sit back and perhaps are much more in our homes and living our own lives. So what does it take to actually bring people into the space of community and work for something that is a collective good?
It's a real good question for me because I, you know, for the first half of my life, I was just kind of an individual following my own individual things. And then I got into this and found out other people came around. And I'm not a really good, like, community leader, I don't think. But I really grew to enjoy these common projects, and common projects bring out the remarkable qualities of other people. I'd been living in such a thought world that now this was a world of honoring, craft and being and all of that, and thinking in practical ways about the world, like things like gravity and sloped hills and all of that. And I was busy solving things, and other people wanted to be busy solving things and working within the constraints of a home lot or a area by a city street or urban situations or rural situations. And I found that people really gravitated to less talk, more action. And if anything, we were just like, I had people calling me and schools calling me and stuff like that. And I would just like put it out there on our, we have a Greensboro Permaculture Guild. And so these things would be put out. Would someone like to talk to someone about, their school? And we also had the thing, we wanted to create incomes for people. We wanted to create livelihoods. We were not there. We weren't getting money from anyone, and we wanted to find things paying for ourselves. So we charged fees, and most people, 90% accepted them willingly. And they really felt they were actually getting so much information that keeping them from making disastrous decisions. So I guess it was that we did projects. We didn't initially, a lot had met through one-day workshops at my home. Yeah. Then I did what's equivalent to a 14-day long workshop to be certified as a permaculture designer. So they had all done that as well. And then we started meeting weekly at Deep Roots, an organic grocer here in town. And on Tuesdays at noon, we would just get together and hobnob and talk about projects and meet new people coming in. And that worked for a couple of years. And then the whole organization kind of changed because people started getting jobs. Yeah. Science center, full-time paying jobs. And, like 6 or 7 really of the very best millennial aged got full-time jobs, and suddenly they couldn't meet at 12 o'clock and they were really busy. And that changed the nature of the organization. There weren't as many people that would just go out as designers. So we had to kind of tuck in a bit and choose more. But in terms of community, it was, we don't exist. We're not a study group. Yeah. We're not a study group. We're not a very much a self-analysis group either. We like to do things, and we are inspired because we're working, with nature, and it just seems to create a caring, observant community that is courteous to one another and full of surprises and open to the kind of the least of these, because we're having to learn from not the least, but the best, of course, of nature. But as humans, we were so socialized into downplaying all of these things. And we felt that, so the community building took care of itself, although at times I've really wanted some great organizer just to step in and kind of take over and said, we're going to fix up the website. We're going to, get some more meetings back. And after the meeting, actually, I was just talking to Jenny about that, because she has, even with her busy schedule, has stepped forward to kind of maybe begin some things, and so on and so forth.
And who's Jenny, by the way?
Jenny Kimmel, who I interjected at the end, and is this just marvelous person as a singer, songwriter, anthropologist, naturalist, and I'll be helping her some with, she's teaching now. She's become the primary teacher now that I've kind of retired from the design course.
Yeah.
But people will be coming over to my home for one weekend of that design course.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer. I don't know if it touched on.
Yeah. I'd like to pull some things out from what you said in a pattern that I see, because I very much in my work looking at community, there's so many needs across the board, you know, and I'm trying to kind of understand what are the patterns that actually make virtuous things happen, what you've been able to do. And in a way, this is my take on it. There's somebody like you who cares about something, who just starts doing it, right? And then people see that, and it's a living example. And there are all kinds of people like Jenny, who you mentioned, or Nick, for instance, who are out there in the community, but may not necessarily be connected to each other, may not know, you know, who else is doing this. So I think as you talked about meetups and such, also become important for actually bringing people together to exchange ideas.
Yeah, very important.
The third piece that you talked about is actually doing things, right? If it's just a social club, you talk about ideas, and that's one thing, but to actually lean into its action and making tangible things happen. And furthermore, I think something that's been part of your work that's, I think, also exceptional is that, see, if we look at cities, sometimes people think about grand projects that might exist in one place. We've got this garden downtown or whatever, right? But you've tried to do it so that it's, like you say, every place is green space. How can we have this all over the map, if you will? And one of the things right now in Greensboro, which is a real issue, is around inclusion, right? So this last phase of Greensboro's development has been focused on kind of the downtown kind of area and revitalizing that. And that's been a great story.
Yeah.
But there are so many other parts of Greensboro that need development.
Yeah.
And how do we, as you've done, you know, build models that can be replicated all across the city? So I don't know if you've got any thoughts, but that's my take about, you know, listening to you and so many others who've been able to step in and make good things happen in Greensboro.
Yeah. Well, that sets off a lot of thoughts. One is that the completion of the Greenway and working with Action Greensboro, Dabney Sanders, offers a very visible place that is a greenway. and Dabney is very open to the work of the Permaculture Guild to come in, and our latest idea is these gardens for migratory species, which are coming up and down the East Coast and finding fewer and fewer habitats on which to depend. And she's just said, well, use the Greenway. So, you know, there's a whole list of projects. And so this Friday, we're going to scoot around, some of us, and we're going to look at sites where we can focus and concentrate. So things like that just keep building and coming. Yesterday at the meeting that we had of the pollinating possibilities, I met an older fellow, I mean, a little younger than me, actually, probably, who is part of on the east side of Greensboro, Mount Zion Church, David Worthington, I think it was, something like that. And he wants to, they have 25 acres, and they want to do a walkway that is, would be an exercise walkway where you have exercise along the way. And he said, it'd be nice to have some flowers in there. And I said, it sounds like you're talking about a greenway out there. And he said, well, yeah, we kind of are, because it's very nice out there. And I said, well, there's a greenway here, but that's not serving your community. And I said, what if you just reframed it as a greenway that has some exercise sites, but it is also doing a lot of other things, like multiple functions for the single space. And he thought, well, let's talk some more about that. So I immediately I talked to Jenny about it and, thinking who can, because I don't know if I can have time. But anyway, that opens up something. And I'd love to do something like that because it would address this kind of east-west, thing going on in Greensboro. And so I want those kinds of things happen.
It's terrific. So really looking to the future, in a way, you've devoted your life to this work here, right? And there's so much more yet to be done, and a lot of people who probably care, who pick up the mantle. Yesterday, we also got to hear from James Gardner, who's got this community garden where he's not only growing food, but he's creating a space that can develop young people as well and build capabilities. So it's really inspiring to hear about some of the next generation of efforts that are there. What are your hopes? What do you hope might happen in Greensboro in the future if you were to wave a magic wand and say, well, this is what we could do to really create a space that embraces nature and creates thriving for people?
Well, I would love to, I think that I would love that the permaculture group would connect to other kind of cognate groups, like the walking group that wants,
outdoor effort,
there can be some really interesting places to walk and see. Like at one point you were mentioning like a garden tour and so on. That could be certainly one of their events. And I think old organizations of Audubon, Sierra Club, all of that maybe they are really working and get with it. I don't know. To me, in many ways, they're not real visible. But they seem to be doing things. They need to be like doing things and building things. I would, of course, like to see more spaces become green. And for the city, and unfortunately, Holy Trinity Church, as part of their new parking lot, destroyed the garden they had there that we had contributed. The Permaculture Guild had contributed a perennial food forest to that community garden, and they tore that all down for a parking lot, the most mundane and most counterproductive kind of structure that you can imagine. And that's part of my beef with the religious imagination is a very truncated kind of imagination in America. So I'd like to see churches, schools, all the institutions get on board. But I realize that this takes organization, and I, at times, have just been completely worn out and went through that a couple of years ago. I just said, don't look to me. And since then, I've kind of come back. But it takes some money, and it takes people, it takes organizers, and that kind of thing. I really don't know how to marshal that, how to bring that together.
And I think the Greenway, maybe as one example, I think is a collaboration between the city and civic institutions to find a way to create something that works for everyone in this mix, right? And so I think I'm hoping that, as we move to the future, maybe there is a need, of course, for a church to have a parking lot for people who come there to park their cars. But to your point, I think what are creative ways that we could meet those needs in a way, but also kind of create the gardens that we also need. So that's some of the challenge for the future. Maybe I wanted to, as we start to close out here and maybe coming back to your beginnings as a professor, and sometimes what professors do is teach theory. Looking back, are there maybe 3 or so lessons that you might distill out that you might offer would-be change makers about what you've learned for creating change? I know this would be off the top of your head, but what comes to mind? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think any leader or teacher has to kind of be the change that he or she is putting out there. And young people especially really respond if you're out there working, and in this case, sweating and that kind of thing, and working alongside. That makes a real difference. I think that people like to be challenged with difficult and complex ideas that have a lot of ambiguity to them, which all of these issues about how we approach climate change and this new age which is coming upon us is the most complex problem that humans have ever encountered, and that should stimulate and bring people together, and leaders should not hold back on its complexities and ambiguities. I think people need really something to live for. And this fills my life with meaning, and I don't have to search for it in self-help books or, a bunch of things. It's just, I just walk out in my garden every morning, and it's more a matter of listening in certain places, then I feel that we have to kind of think big, and a city ultimately, I think I mentioned it, but a city ultimately needs to give back more than it takes, and we have learned a lot of ways to do that, and Greensboro should put itself on the map by being the greenest city on the East Coast. And that's the answer to so many of its problems. And whether it's racial, economic, educational kinds of things, we could just become a dynamic center. And with the fact that people say, wow, people there, they work together, they care for each other, and they're creating a better world. So that's the big picture, saying, wow, wouldn't that be something? Yeah.
You've connected a lot of things in there. I think, as you've mentioned, like the big challenge for the world, of course, is the environmental challenge that we're facing, that we're nowhere close to being organized enough to really change our behaviors and create these very fundamental shifts that we have. At the same time, you focused as we as individuals perhaps don't need to feel powerless, right? In the midst of all of this, there's things that we can do here locally, that give our lives meaning and create possibility. And so Greensboro, as being perhaps the greenest city here on the East Coast, is a possibility that we can really create. And if people all over the world see opportunities for what we could do in our own neighborhoods locally, then we start to transform the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you connecting the dots, and maybe as you've shared over what you've done, and some things have worked and some things haven't, but just leaning into it with the belief that you're going to do your best work as much as you can and see what actually comes out of it. And in many ways, I think you may not necessarily know all the impacts that you create. So I'll just share a quick story. So we went over to a place called the Public Orchard, which is one of the projects that you were working on. And my daughter, who's in high school, came in there, and she was so amazed. She said, "This is my favorite place in Greensboro." So there are probably impacts that your work has that
Yeah.
you'll never get to hear about.
Yeah.
So thank you for all that you've done over the years,
Oh.
Charlie, to make Greensboro a much better place
No.
for all of us. I'm really inspired by it, and I hope through this podcast we can share it with more people.
Well, great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.